Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I am going to talk about from chaos to clarity, how FormKit solves common form problems. Forms are probably like the most boring topic that we can talk about as developers. So hopefully this will not be boring and it will make forms less boring for you in the future. Um, I'm Justin. These are some of the projects I've worked on or currently maintain. FormKit, which is what I'm talking to you about today, is a Vue.js form building framework. We'll talk about that. Arrow.js is a basically like a really small, lightweight alternative to React and Vue and whatnot. Auto Animate, if you haven't checked it out, is a great way to add really quick animations to your app. And then formerly Vue Formulate, which is the predecessor to FormKit, was one of my projects as well. And I'm a co-founder of a small agency called Braid. So that's who I am. But this is also me. This is a photo of me doing web development in 2019. Specifically working on a large customer application that had lots and lots of forms. And if you've had to deal with that mess, you might know what I'm talking about. But the reality is that in the web development world, there's a general sentiment of like, why? What's the problem? Forms are easy. So that's what I want to talk about today. Forms are easy. And fundamentally, it's true. Forms are easy. Here's a valid form. We've got a form tag, 2 inputs inside of it. This could be a login or a registration. And that is all you need to have a valid form. So forms are easy. And in fact, look here. Here's our rendered form right next to it. Now, okay, to be fair, we could probably do a little bit better. Why don't we go ahead and add a button? Somebody's going to want to actually submit this form. So here we've got a button, type is submit, and now we have a form that we can actually submit by clicking a button. Pretty good, right? Nothing too complicated here. But really, we should probably add labels on there. You know, it's hard to know what you're supposed to type into an input if you don't have a label on there. So now we've got a label username and a label password. But you eagle-eyed developers will have noticed that, whoopsies, we just caused a problem there. These 2 elements, our label and our input, are not semantically linked in any which way, shape, or form. And so this is an accessibility problem. You probably already know this. In fact, there's been talks today about this. You need to either wrap your input in a label, and this is one way to do it, although it's not really the recommended way. There's a lot of kind of problems there. Like if I want to style that username text, I'm inadvertently styling my input. It's hard to put things together. So generally, we do not do this, and instead we use a for attribute. And now here's our form. We've added our 4 attributes, and we've added IDs to our 2 inputs, and now we have a good form, right? Well, we should probably add some help text because it turns out this is a registration form. So it's better to say something with your input like you need to enter a new username so people don't think they're logging in. Okay, so let's slap some help text on here. We've got a span for type help and wrote a little bit of help text. Great, except for, oops, we did it again. We've already inadvertently caused our second accessibility problem. We have 2 DOM elements, once again, that are not semantically linked, and one is describing the other. So we need to slap a little aria describe by here, username help, and then add an ID to our help text to make sure we got all that straightened out. Okay, so our form's getting a little bit more messy, a little bigger, but this is still manageable. So now we've got that together. This is our rendered form. It's not the most beautiful thing in the world, but technically this is a form. Now, there's just a few more things that we need to add. Okay, we need to do some validation there to make sure that the username is valid, it's not taken up, that the password's good. We probably should add a password confirmation. We need to add probably some internationalization. If our app has any kind of reach, then we need to make sure we translate the things that are in there. We also need to collect all the values from the form and then submit the values. If we're doing an asynchronous request, then we probably need to apply some sort of loading state to the form. We need to handle backend errors, whether the server's down or there's a validation error, you know, we need to handle some sort of backend errors and then put them on the form. So we're just going to do this real quick, except for how long is this talk? I've only got 20 minutes. I don't have enough time to go through all of these things, which really raises the question. I have a 2 input form. Are forms easy? Well, there's a common misconception, I think, out there. Here's a great quote, tweet from Ryan Florence, who is one of the creators of React of Remix. I don't think there should even be form abstractions. Forms are fundamentally markup, user interactions, event handlers, state management, and requests. Between React and Remix, what will a form library add here? Toss in some validation functions and be done with it. That's a fair sentiment, except I would argue that that would apply to almost anything out there. In fact, let's replace all the references of form in here with framework. Could be any of these Vue or React or Svelte. We'll just cross those off and we'll replace them with framework here. I don't think that there should even be frameworks. Frameworks are fundamentally markup, user interactions, event handlers, state management, requests. Between HTML, Java, and JavaScript, what will a framework add here? Toss in some JavaScript functions and be done with it. And I think what Ryan's getting at is that the domain of a form is really the same domain as a framework, as an application. So what can we add? If forms are markup and user interactions, event handlers, state management, and requests, like he says, which I agree that they are, then they deserve a framework. And that's essentially what I'm here to talk to you about right now is FormKit, which is a form building framework. It's an entire framework intended for the purpose of solving this problem that we as developers are spending sometimes a majority of our time working on. What it's not is a UI library. And there's some confusion about this, but it is not a UI library. It's not a replacement necessarily for something like Vuetify, although you can use them together. It's also not intended to be taking over the domain of rendering your headers and your menus. So where do we start? Where do I start to try to describe this? When I was thinking up this talk, I sat down and I wanted to pen out some of the features of FormKit. And the reality is that there's a lot. This was just the start of the list. There's a lot more. And I can't sit down here and talk to you all about all of these. So I have come up with 4 things to talk about during this talk. We are going to learn about how FormKit uses a single component to solve a lot of these problems, how input values are collected automatically, how to apply validation with a single prop, and finally, we're going to touch on a really neat feature called form generation. So let's talk about a single component. In FormKit, there is basically one component called FormKit. It's not too tough. And it's roughly approximate to what you would expect an input to be in HTML. You can, for example, add a type, FormKit type checkbox, and that's roughly equivalent to input type checkbox. It's going to render a checkbox for you. But you can also say FormKit type select, and this is equivalent to a select input. Now, you notice, though, that in HTML, we don't use input type select. We actually have a different syntax to describe a select input. And that's part of what FormKit does, is it kind of smooths out those inconsistencies in HTML. So shipping out of the core is every single native input in HTML. You've got your buttons and your ranges, your submits, your URL inputs, your text, of course, checkboxes, radios, all of the stuff that everybody's used to. But in addition now, as we're trying to roll out some of these pro inputs, we've got some things that we call synthetic inputs in addition to that. So autocomplete, state pickers, masks, things that don't ship in a native browser. Additionally, you can wrap third-party inputs, like you could pull a tag list from Vuetify and you could wrap it in a FormKit. So let's take a look at how we do that. Well, fundamentally, you just say whatever the type is that you want to render, so FormKit type text, and then all of that other work that we did in the first little bit of this talk, adding the labels and the help text, for example, those kinds of things are just going to come for free. So here you can see with this little bit of code, the actual rendered output, which is probably a little hard to see on the stream, but hopefully you get the idea here, includes things like your ARIA described by. It automatically applies an ID to your input and makes sure that the label is pointing to that semantically. You don't see it in this particular instance, but validation messages are also added with appropriate accessibility in mind. It's got wrappers around it, so that way styling is very easy. It has support for Tailwind and whatever styling framework of choice you want to use. Here you can see that it's got input 0, which has been automatically generated for the input tag available, and then the ARIA described by is already on the help text. Now, the cool thing is I can just swap that out, change nothing except for the type. Now type checkbox, and I get a completely different rendered output. Nothing about this is particularly the same, except some of the wrappers are the same. But I've got, for example, a completely new element in here, FormKit decorator, and that's to allow us to create nice checkboxes. If you're familiar at all with styling checkboxes in HTML, you know that you can't really style the checkbox itself. You need something adjacent to it. And so those kinds of things, think like problems that us developers are just really used to having to slog through, are sort of solved. Okay, now what if I want to add more than one option in my checkboxes? Well, I can just add options, red, green, blue, for example. And now I get a completely different set of completely different markup with a field set, for example, because that's the most appropriate way to render a group of checkboxes. And it's not even a small amount of content. I got quite a bit here because that's what it actually takes to render multiple checkboxes in a nice semantic way. And this is what you would get on the other side. You can see the help text is in a slightly different position for better user experience. You've got all of those checkboxes there. They each have all their own appropriate wrapping. It's inside of a field set, so on and so forth. So a single component. Some advantages: the learning curve is really easy. You don't need to go remember a whole bunch of different component types. This is something that sort of bugs me about a lot of the UI frameworks that are out there, is I have to remember, is that a combo box component, or is a combo text box, or is a combo autocomplete text tag list box? It's hard to remember. So in FormKit, you always know it's a FormKit input, and that leads to a consistent API. And this is super valuable on a larger team. Everybody knows when they see that component that it's a reference to a particular set of APIs that are built around building forms. And it also helps eliminate some of those inconsistencies in HTML. You always know you have the same prop structure, which is really helpful. So for example, here I've got input type text and a text area in native HTML. And it always drives me crazy that I have to stick the value of my text area inside the body of my text area versus as the value attribute. But in FormKit, these are both smoothed out. You can say type text area or type text. It's going to work the same way. All right, input values are collected automatically. Majorly underrated feature, in my opinion. Here, I've got a standard form just written in Vue with a submit handler at the top of my form. And down inside of here, I've got some fictitious components called my text. And you can see that what I'm doing is I'm v-modeling the address, I'm v-modeling the second line, the city, the state, the zip code. And then I'm going to try to collect all those values for my submit handler. And this is completely not required in FormKit. So I'm going to risk it here. I'm going to switch over to a live demo, and hopefully everybody's able to see this. So on my left-hand side, I have the exact same form that we were just looking at, but written with FormKit. So here I've got FormKit type text, it's a street address, address to, so on and so forth. There's no v-modeling. In fact, I don't even have a script block on here. So what I'm going to do is just show that these are being collected automatically for you. I'm going to destructure the value out of my form, and I will just print it at the top here. Whoop. All right. As you can see, all the values of my form are automatically being collected for me. Well, that's really nifty, right? I didn't have to write vmodel. There's not all that repetition. But what's even better about this is that it works automatically at depth. So for example, let me just create an address component. I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste all of these FormKit inputs right out of this form. I'm going to plop them over here. Don't even need a script block. Don't even need a style block. Just going to paste these in here. All right. And now I'm going to add a script setup, and I will import my address from an address.vue, and I'm just going to plop it in here. Okay. And now we'll go ahead and add another FormKit input right here. We'll say this is type text, and this is somebody's name, and the label that we'll put on here is your name. Okay, excellent. So you can see your name, and then all of these are being rendered by my subcomponent called address. Wonderful. Now, if I destructure this back out of here again, I'm going to take the value of my form, print it right here. And you can see that all of my values are still being collected even though they're at depth. And in fact, we could go to infinite depth of components and they're still going to be automatically bubbling up to the nearest form, which is pretty handy. But what if I want my address to actually be nested? Well, I can have that in my data structure. I just do a FormKit type group, and I'm going to name this address. Okay, and I'll just wrap all of these. Whoops. I'll just wrap all these here. FormKit. Okay, so all I've done is nest all of these under a group type. And now you can see I've got my name here is Justin, and my address is working fine. It's all nested underneath there. So this really, really helps with the reusability of your code and your forms. You can do this at any depth. There's other types of structuring components too. I wish I had time to tell you more about it, but got to keep rolling here. So there's a lot less boilerplate. You don't need to do all of the V models on everything. That's one big advantage of this automatic collection. It encourages reusability. And, you know, like you saw with the address, now if I had created that as an address component in my project, I could reuse that all over the place. I could reuse it on the checkout page, on the account page, on the registration. I could use it wherever I need to. And I don't even need to do all of the plumbing and the wiring to get it hooked up. And it avoids two-way binding, which is a really great feature in Vue. The fact that we have vModel in Vue is definitely an overall benefit versus something like React. However, if you've ever used vModel on a really large project with lots of nested objects and things like that, you know that it inevitably is going to cause you problems. And this is great because it allows you to have as much flexibility as vModel without needing to do that full two-way binding. And FormKit has ways to explicitly set values down inside of the form too. Okay, so the third thing I want to talk about is applying validation to a single prop. This is relatively self-explanatory, but it's still really valuable. So here I've got a type checkbox. I've got some flavors that you can pick from. Maybe, you know, this is a great ice cream shop or something like that. And it's going to render my checkboxes that look like that. Great. By the way, FormKit's style agnostic. So if you want to have these rendered a different way, you can do that very easily with either semantic CSS or Tailwind. There's full Tailwind support for every single DOM element that we render. So here we go. Validation required pipe to say there's more than one rule, and then minimum of two. This is really familiar if you're familiar with Laravel or to some degree. vValidate does theirs in a similar way. These are not the same library at all, but we've converged on somewhat of a similar syntax here. So let's take a look at how that works. Here we are again. This is our checkbox. I can come in here, check multiple inputs. You can see there's no validation whatsoever on this. And if I want to add validation, it's exactly what I was saying here. We're going to say you need a minimum of two. And here you can see when I check one, now I cannot have fewer than two flavors. I check two, and those are already done for me. And one of the really interesting things is that you'll notice you didn't need to write those messages. FormKit ships already with languages, I think 34 languages for full internationalization support on every single message that ships inside of FormKit, whether it's a UI piece or a validation message result. It already has all of that bundled in because that's a huge pain for people to deal with. So those are already in there. Some advantages of that. Well, for one, the learning curve is, again, very, very easy. You don't have to, figure out how to create a model of your data and then model that against validation rules. You just apply them. The API is consistent again. When you're looking at some code that was written with FormKit that you didn't write, you already know where to look for to find out if the validation is there, and it's co-located on the input itself. So the same reason that so many people like Tailwind, you apply styles directly to the elements and where they are. Well, the same kind of thing applies with validation rules. You want those validation rules to be proximate to where they're being applied. And FormKit gives you that ability. All right, and I've only got a little bit of time to touch on form generation, but it's definitely worth taking a look at. This is definitely one of the community's favorite features so far. Form generation allows you to essentially generate forms from a schema. And a schema, in our case, is a JSON serializable data format for storing DOM structure and component implementations, including FormKit forms. That's what the FormKit schema allows. So that's a bunch of jumble. But what does it actually mean? What it means is that you can have something like this div. Okay, we've got a div with hello world, relatively simple. And then you can represent that using a serializable format. So in this case, it's basically a JSON compatible object here. You could just serialize that to JSON, no problem. You've got $EL, which says what DOM element's going to get rendered, and then what's going to get rendered inside of it is just the children. So you can take this and you can pass that object as a prop to the FormKit schema component, and then you get the rendered output of div hello world. Great, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is you can store that. You can store your schema. You can store it in a database. You can store it in a flat file. You can ship it over the internet. It's easy to pass as an HTTP argument. It's easy to pass back as some JSON body. It's easy to post somewhere. It's a very transportable format, and you can do basically anything that you can do inside of the template tag of a Vue component. You can express using this JSON format. So here's 3 things that you can render using the format. You can render DOM elements. And here you can see the $EL indicates that this is going to be a DOM element. You can render components using the $CMP. That means a component is coming, and then you can pass some props just like you would anywhere else. And as shorthand, you can use the $FormKit. And in this case, I'm rendering a select list with some options. And you notice that I don't even need to nest it. In this case, under props, you can just put all of the props as top level right there. But what really makes the FormKit schema powerful is the fact that you can write expressions inside of your JSON serializable strings. For example, you can write Boolean logic, equals, ands, ors, does not equal, things like that. You can write full arithmetic, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. You can write function calls, conditional rendering. You can render slots from a higher level component. All of that's available in JSON. So let's take a real quick look here. Here I have a schema. You can see it's a FormKit. I have a type form. It looks like I'm buying some widgets here. I have some children here, and my child is the things that are going to go inside of my form. So I've got a number input called quantity. And then down here, when you look at the FormKit schema, you can see we're passing that JSON in as the schema prop. But then we're also passing this reactive object of data in. And in this case, the only thing in here is dollars, which is an internationalization function to just convert a number into formatted dollars. But we could put whatever else we want inside of here. Okay, since this data is passed in here, it becomes available to my JSON using a dollar symbol. So here, we're going to add the total price right here. So to start with, a valid piece of schema is just a plain string. So I'm going to put a plain string right here, and I'm going to render the quantity. And I do that by accessing the value of my form automatically. It's automatically destructured for me, and then I can access quantity. And as you'll see, it has become an actual reactive thing, even though I passed it some static JSON. Pretty neat. But what's even neater is I can then multiply that and write a full expression here as a string. So let's say these widgets cost $2.33. Okay, and now if I start manipulating this, you can see it's actually performing my multiplication directly in line there. Well, that's not great because as you can see, we get these weird rounding errors like this because JavaScript is JavaScript. So instead, we're going to wrap this in a function call to dollars, and we're just going to pass that value in there. This is not JavaScript. I want to be very clear. We're not doing an eval or anything like that. There's a tiny little lightweight compiler that's actually compiling this into render functions for us. So here you go. Now I've got an actual dollar value here. And of course, if we wanted to pass the amount in there, we could say the value, or I guess the price, we'll call it price. And we're going to say the price is $2.33 instead. And then instead of using $2.33 here, we could use price. And now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so that's a really quick look at how the FormKit schema works with some expressions. So as I said, those are only 4 features out of a really large set of features. I hope you guys try to go and explore some of this. And it really brings up the question, are forms easy? I would submit that they are not. If you guys have ever built really large forms, you know that they take a tremendous amount of time, unless you're using FormKit. Okay, thank you. That's it for me. There is an entire course on FormKit on Vue School, which I would really encourage everybody to go check out. You can also go to formkit.com, which is where all the documentation for this lives. My Twitter handle is JP Schroeder, and at use FormKit is the other one. Thanks.
Yay, Justin. And as something that I just found out that I'm kind of excited about, I'm really excited about, if anybody is going to Vue.js Amsterdam, Vue School will be making some shirts for FormKit and Vue
That's
School.
right, yeah.
So very excited about that. And are you ready for, you had a ton of questions come up. People are excited about this. So are you?
Well, they
are
should
you
be.
Ready? Are you ready for all of the fun questions?
I'm ready. Bring it. Let the onslaught begin.
I hope one of the easier ones, Windows, Mac, or other.
Mac OS. I've been using Mac OS since OS 8. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm an old schooler.
I'm going to go in order on these then, other than that one. Are there any new features for FormKit in the pipeline?
Oh man, are there ever? Well, the date picker is coming down fast. So one of the things that we're trying to do right now is our team is sort of trying to diverge. There's about 7 people right now working on FormKit almost full time. So it's a lot. There's a lot of horsepower going into making this really good. Nice. The date picker is very comprehensive. It's really, really solid. Date picker, date range picker. There's a transfer list, which if you've ever used those inputs where there's multiple 2 panels and you can move things from one into another, that's going in there, as well as some cool Kanban board kind of things. Yeah, there's a lot of new inputs on the way. There's a lot of stability fixes in the near term. And then we've got some things we're going to keep a little secret.
Ooh. So make sure you follow FormKit on Twitter, y'all. Make sure we stay up to date.
Yeah.
But what's the difference between FormKit and using other form validation plugins like Vue Formulate and Vue Validate?
Good question. So I actually also wrote Vue Formulate, and basically it's Vue 2 only. That's the biggest difference there. FormKit is rewritten from the ground up, based on Vue Formulate. The concepts are largely transferable, but this is a much more advanced library than Vue Formulate was. That being said, we do not support Vue 2 with FormKit. So it's intended to be a future-facing tool as opposed to Vue Formulate. Vue Validate is similar to FormKit in its validation syntax. So you would, if you're familiar with Vue Validate, you're somewhat familiar with FormKit, except that FormKit ships everything else too. So we ship all of the inputs, all of the markup, all of the validation messages, everything that normally doesn't come with just a validation library also comes with FormKit.
Very cool. Thank you for breaking that down. And this one's exciting. They've seen you talk about the mask feature, and it's amazing. Are there any other awesome FormKit tricks that they should know about?
Well, the other, I agree. The mask input is really cool. I wish I had time to talk more about it. The autocomplete input is really unique. It does what a lot of other autocomplete inputs do, in that you can select something from a list, or you can make a request and select things from a list. It supports, pagination and infinite scrolling and all of these other kind of complex use cases. But it does one thing that I've never seen another input do, and that is you can select multiple things in your autocomplete and have them render as actual text in the text input with just comma separation. And then when you click on them, it automatically expands your selection to be whichever piece of that input is represented. So for example, if you have United States and Ghana next to each other, be United States, comma, Ghana, you click on Ghana and it'll select that whole word. And then you can type and replace that one instance, or you can remove it. And so it's this really neat, and it actually works really well with accessibility too. It's this really neat sort of hack around a text input to make it operate really well for selecting multiple values in a way that users won't get, they won't get in trouble by, typing the wrong syntax or something like that.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I mean, is there one feature about FormKit that excites you most that you haven't talked about yet?
Okay. So one of the things that I think is really, really cool is our inputs in FormKit are actually written using schema. So I didn't mention that in the talk, but this is often a problem, and it's not just Vue with any component framework. Let's say you wanted to override the help text of an input. You didn't like, we use I can't remember if we use a span or a div, but either way, let's say we use a span and you didn't want to use a span for the help text. You wanted to use an H1 for some reason. Well, the problem is if you use a slot, you remove the functionality that was previously rendering the help text. And maybe there's some logic there. Maybe it says render the help text in this scenario, but not in this scenario. And so you often, when you start getting into slots, you're often required to recreate some of the functionality that the original author intended. But FormKit has this schema under the hood. So you can explicitly say, just with a prop, hey, the DOM element that is representing that help text, I want to change it to an H1. And you can do that without replacing anything else. It'll just change the rendering on that one element. All of the logic for what goes into the element can stay the same. And every single element inside of FormKit is rendered that way. So every single element can be selectively overridden. And we call those sections. So if you're looking through the docs, look at sections, and they can also be, they're also all slots. Every single DOM element's also a slot. Every single DOM element is also addressable with classes for you Tailwind folks.
Well, that brings us to our very next question.
Yes.
Can you use FormKit with Tailwind CSS?
You absolutely can. Designed from the ground up for Tailwind. I mean, not exclusively. We ship a CSS file as an adjacent CSS file to add styles, but we also have an entire guide on how to do it with Tailwind. You can easily address every single DOM element inside of FormKit using Tailwind. So there's easy classes like wrapper class, and you put whatever classes or input class and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Y'all are just making me realize that I need to finish my website because I got stuck on Tailwind and Markdown issue. And then I need a form on my website to have people on the show. So I'm like, oh, I should probably start doing this. All the ideas now. All right. Can you talk briefly about Auto Animate? It's such a cool library.
Yeah, Auto Animate's a fun little library. Obviously in Vue, we have transition and transition groups, and those are great. There are times where you need to add transitions to either things that you don't touch, or you're not in the context of Vue, or you just want to do it fast. So transition group is really great, but sometimes it's kind of cumbersome to add a transition group, make sure everything is, properly set up and whatnot. Auto Animate's basically a directive that you can just say, v auto animate on a parent, and then any DOM elements getting added, removed, or moved underneath there will automatically get transitions. And there's basically no configuration. Technically, you can add some configuration if you really want to, but the intention is to be like prettier for animations. So like these animations are good enough for almost all use cases. Just take what's out of the box. And it allows you to add, really smooth animations to a variety of things that normally are kind of a pain to do. So yeah, that's a really quick overview. It also works in every framework: React, Svelte. We shipped solid support today, Vue, everything. So.
All right. Thank you. Can options consist of an array of objects where the value is, say, an ID, but the displayed string is another property?
Good question. So there's three ways to describe what gets rendered inside of options. And options are used for select lists, radios, checkboxes, autocompletes, tag lists, a bunch of different places. We reuse the same structure over and over again. At the most basic level, you can have an array of strings. A little bit more complicated, you can have an object where all of the keys of the object are the values and all of the values are the labels. And then a little bit more complicated than that is you can have an array of objects where each of those has a label and a value. And the label will become the label and the value will become the value. And then optionally on top of that, you can have an attributes, an ATTRS, adders, where you can say like, hey, I want this one to be disabled. I want this one to be enabled. I want to put an arbitrary attribute on this option, and then we'll put those out for you. What we don't do that some other libraries do is let you say, this prop tells me what the value is, and this prop tells me what the label is. And in this case, we're trying to go with convention over configuration. So we are shipping basically a standardized format for all of these things. If you want to return a ginormous object as the value of a select list, you can do that by just setting it to be the value. So everybody knows basically how it works. You can map over your array if you want to do that to produce your values. But we go with the convention instead of a configuration.
Thank you. And all right, is there a web component support for FormKit? And if no, will there be a web component support?
Well, we're not ready to announce future plans, but maybe we'll say that.
Okay. I like that.
No today. Right now, it's Vue.
Okay. And is it possible to change the checkbox radio icon? And if so, is there a way to change it globally so they don't need to change it for each component?
It's a great question. Where to start? Okay, so FormKit has a very unique configuration mechanism, and it came out of the place of realizing that forms are very unique in the way that they are configured. You could have two identical forms on a page and you want a slightly different configuration for one versus the other. So all configuration in FormKit, including icons, is hierarchical, meaning you could apply an icon to an individual input. So yes, to answer the question, yes, you can change the icon. You can just say, I think it's like checked icon, and then you can put whatever you want in there. Or you can define it one layer up on the form. You could say the checked icons for this form are this value, or you could take it a higher level up yet and say for this entire project, the checked icons is such and such. And they always can cascade down like that. And FormKit actually ships with an entire icon library. You can also use it with Font Awesome, but icons are part of forms, right? And so we want to be a comprehensive form library. So yeah, we ship with a basic icon library, and you can add icons as prefixes or suffixes to any input. You can replace any of the icons that we ship automatically. You can use slots for it. Well, sections, right? You can use slots. You can use schema. You can use a prop. So yeah, there's a dozen ways to do this.
Okay. It definitely sounds like and I know we've gotten a ton more questions. We have two more right now, but sure. As a request for everybody, I know they have lots of curiosity questions. If you have time to go over to the chat to check it out, I know a lot of people would appreciate that. Can someone embed an iframe with a third-party input fields to a FormKit forms and submit them together?
Ooh, good question. Complicated question. That really gets more into web fundamentals than FormKit. But if you control an iframe and you control the host location that's showing the iframe, then you can communicate back and forth. And fundamentally, FormKit doesn't care where you're getting your values from. So if you wanted to have an iframe with a bunch of form fields inside of it, and then transmit those with a post message back up to the parent, and then you created a custom input, and FormKit has lots of documentation on how to create custom inputs, then you could take the values from your iframe and just post them back to the form using what we call a FormKit node. You would just tell the node, hey, here's my new value. And yeah, it would become part of your form values. So yes, it could fundamentally solve that problem.
I love those answers of fundamentally yes.
You have to do some work. You have to do some work.
Yes. I have gotten a lot of puzzles for my website and trying to mush it all together. And people are like, it technically could work. It could. Now, not always will it. And it'll take a lot of work. So I just, I think that's great with the iframe. Can you have custom error messages on input fields?
Yeah. I mean, error messages are such a significant part of forms that we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And we actually have two classifications of these. There's input errors, and then we have validation errors. And we consider those two different things. One of them resolves, right? A validation error goes away when you've resolved the validation. You can customize those. So all of them, you can always say validation messages, the required rule, use this other message, no problem. But then there's also this other concept of input errors. And this is something I would have talked a lot longer about if we had tons of time. But a common problem with forms is when you submit a form and you submit it to a backend and the backend spits back like, hey, that username is not valid or something like that. And you didn't want to do all the work to do the validation ahead of time. Well, now you have a validation message. Your form might be very long. We all know as developers that the right thing to do is take that validation message and put it on the input that caused the problem, maybe highlight it in red or something like that. But it's a ton of work to do that for every single input. And so what we do is we just take all the validation messages, we put them in a big bundle and we pop it up as a toast message or something. And they're like, look, here's all the problems with your form. And then hopefully that stays open long enough for the person to resolve them. But reality, it's probably closed by the time, and then they got to go. It's a pain, right? It's a pain. So FormKit solves that by basically giving you an address for every single input in your form. And that maps roughly to what you get back from the front end. And so you can very easily just say, I want to put a error, can be just a generic error, on a given input. And you can just throw it on that input and it'll automatically find where that is in the form and boom, it'll show up right there.
Awesome. And thank you so much. That was our last question for the day. How does everyone reach out to you, follow up with FormKit? Like, what's the best way to stay in contact?
Yeah. So formkit.com. And on formkit.com, there is a Discord link, and we're pretty active in the Discord. So you can likely reach out to us there. And please follow on Twitter at JPSCHROEDER. That's me.
Yay. Thank you so much, Justin.
All right. Thank you.